And welcome back, and I do mean welcome back. This is the first Three Women show of the new session. I'm Sherry DeNovo, MPP Parkdale High Park, and your host. And I have an exciting show for you today. We have in studio Angela Bischoff. Angela's with No Nuke Bailouts and is also the outreach director of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. Her past activism includes project manager with the Toronto Atmospheric Fund and the Clean Air Partnership, and she organized the annual Smog Summit conferences and managed the educational funding program Cool Schools. Angela is also active promoting sustainable transportation, was one of the advocates behind the recently implemented bike lanes on Bloor, and that was in memory of her late partner, somebody we all remember well, and that was Tucker Gomberg. So Angela, welcome. Welcome to Three Women.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sherry.
A little later in the show, the second half, we're going to have MP Niki Ashton. She's going to be telling us all about the very first day that the Federal House is sitting and what the issues are on the agenda. And of course, we always love to hear from you. You can tweet at us at Sherry DeNovo, CHERIDINOVO. And thank you, Twitter. Finally, after 10 years, I'm verified. Or you can phone in at 416-946-7000 if you're the extroverted type and get your voice on the air along with ours. Angela, tell me, we just came out of the Scarborough Rouge River by-election here in the city of Toronto, and one of the issues that was really foremost in many people's minds was the nuclear situation there. Tell us about it.
Well, that was an interesting by-election because we went into it not sure where the citizenry was at in terms of awareness around the Pickering Nuclear Station. The Pickering Nuclear Station is Canada's oldest, 45 years old. OPG wants to extend its life, and it's like 10 kilometers from Scarborough. Many of the residents in Scarborough in that riding received their KI pills from OPG, meaning they were less than 10 kilometers from.
And what are KI pills?
Those are potassium iodide pills that are supposed to protect your thyroid in the case of a nuclear accident at the Pickering Station.
Doesn't exactly inspire confidence.
No, and anybody within 50 kilometers of any nuclear facility in Ontario can receive free KI pills from OPG. If they contact OPG, just go to the website preparetobesafe.ca. You can order, then that includes almost all of the GTA, definitely out into as far as Mississauga, can order those free pills. And they're good to just have on stock just in case.
But we don't want them. Do we want them? We don't want them.
Well, what we really want is to shut down those nuclear stations, and Pickering is the first one to go. So that's our current campaign. But in Scarborough, we were very surprised during the by-election. We were going door to door. We went to about 15,000 households, incredibly, in that riding. We were just popping them in mailboxes, but you still have an opportunity to talk to lots of people. And then we did both an all-candidates questionnaire where we queried all of the candidates, plus we did a poll of 800 residents in the riding, and 70% of the residents said shut down Pickering if there are alternatives available, which of course there are. So there is not much support anywhere near the station for the extension of Pickering.
And currently the Ontario government's planning on refurbishing Pickering, I gather.
No. So Pickering is Canada's oldest. It was designed to last 30 years. It's now 45, and OPG is requesting a license to extend it till it's age 57 with no refurbishment. What they are wanting to rebuild is the 4 reactors at Darlington. And they claim that while they shut down each of those reactors one at a time to rebuild them, that they will need extra power, and that's why they're calling for the extension of the Pickering Nuclear Station. But it's too old. It's too close to a huge urban population. More than 2 million people live within 30 kilometers of the Pickering Station. So we're calling for them to close it down. Pickering, incredibly, is surplus electricity. We have reduced our electricity demand 13% in the last decade just through conservation. And also we've brought more supply on the grid, green energy supply namely. So we can shut down Pickering without a blip. But even if we did need more electricity, as OPG claims, we could import water power from Quebec at a much lower cost than keeping Pickering open. Incredibly, it costs us about $1 billion a year to keep that station open because it's so old and expensive and inefficient that
And
we
scary.
subsidize it to keep it open, and scary.
So now, what when you talk to government officials about this in the Ministry of Energy, what are they saying?
Well, they say the OPG's line is that we need it. But so what's interesting here is if they were to, so I think everybody agrees it would be cheaper to bring in water power from Quebec. But then if we replaced that electricity with water power from Quebec while we rebuilt the Darlington reactors, there would be no reason to put the Darlington reactors online because the water power from Quebec is much cheaper and greener.
And Darlington's going to cost a fortune, of course.
Yes, much
Nuclear
more.
always does.
Much more expensive
Yeah.
than water power from Quebec. So we're calling for shut down Pickering. It's surplus electricity. We don't need it. And replace the Darlington rebuild with water power from Quebec. They have enough excess that they are selling on the spot market at rock bottom prices. They have enough to supply us to completely replace Darlington at a fraction of the cost of what the Darlington rebuild will cost us.
Now, it was in this throne speech, hydro, of course, and hydro rates. And what we did hear about hydro from the government as they came back last week provincially is that they're going to take the HST off hydro bills. What was your reaction to that?
Well, that's essentially a subsidy. That's making electricity prices even cheaper. And we want to, it's the same thing with fossil fuels. If the prices rise, people will use less, and it will incentivize conservation. Likewise with electricity.
Sure. Now, what about those people up north or those who have the misfortune of having an electrically heated house? And we're hearing this all the time from people who represent them. You know, it's either heat or eat, or is the sort of some of the bills are absolutely outrageous.
And
what's
that's
happening?
exactly why we think cancel the Darlington rebuild, import water power from Quebec, and cancel the Pickering extension. That will lower electricity rates by billions of dollars, or, you know, the costs, the electricity costs by billions of dollars. That's how we lower electricity rates.
I mean, nuclear generally has been responsible for a huge hike in our, and of course the cost overruns of nuclear in our hydro bills, no?
Absolutely. We're still paying down the debt from the nuclear reactors that were built in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, so it's significant. What about those, and I'll be devil's advocate here, who say that, well, if we do want to, look at getting off fossil fuels, if we do want to lower carbon emissions, isn't nuclear clean, green energy?
Well, it's very expensive, and it closes the door on moving to clean, green energy, renewable energy, because as long as we give 60% of the grid, which is what we're giving today to nuclear power, that means that we're shutting out the opportunity to build a renewables revolution, a renewable energy revolution, and likewise with the not only is it super expensive, but we could be importing water power from Quebec at a fraction of the cost. That is renewable energy. Nuclear power is not renewable. We get our uranium from Saskatchewan. There's big issues with mining, First Nations lands, pollution from radiation, radioactivity all along the nuclear fuel chain, including, they may not emit as much CO2 emissions when they're producing electricity, but they're emitting other radioactive, very dangerous materials every day, tritium being the main one. All of our nuclear stations are daily emitting routine releases of tritium, and that's going into our air and our water. It's a carcinogen, a mutagen, and a teratogen, meaning it crosses the placental barrier. These are very dangerous stations. And what if there is an accident? Hello, Fukushima, Chernobyl. It could happen on one of our Great Lakes, on Lake Ontario. How would we evacuate the population? There's still 100,000 people around the Fukushima station that will never be able to return home. Why would we risk it when we have lower cost renewable options?
Now, and that's not even talking about burying the waste, right?
We have no solution for the waste.
And there was something proposed just just recently about burying the waste as well near the Great Lakes, and you might want to comment on that.
Yes,
that was particularly concerning.
OPG's current proposal is to bury all of Ontario's low and intermediate level waste on the Bruce Nuclear Station site, which is right on the edge of Lake Huron. We know that not one deep geological repository ever on the planet has actually fulfilled its promise of not leaking. We have 3 globally, 2 in Germany, 1 in the United States, New Mexico, and they've all leaked. Why would we take that risk when there are many other options? What we're proposing is keeping all the nuclear waste on site until we really have a good solution of how to deal with it, rather than hoping to just bury it 600 meters below the surface, making it much more expensive to ever retrieve if there is a leak, which we know there will be inevitably.
Now, you and your small group of trusted stalwarts are up against a fairly big machine there with the nuclear industry. I mean, we see the ads on television: clean, green energy. Don't worry. There's no images of Homer Simpson, anywhere in those ads. How do you keep going? Like, where's the hope there? This is a money-making machine.
Yes, and we are really small and don't have much funding. The anti-nuclear movement is not that strong in terms of, resources. But, that's how we won the coal phase out, too. That was also a David and Goliath battle, and it was a small group of citizens that came together. That's how the Clean Air Alliance was formed, the group that I'm working with. To call for the coal phase out. Everybody thought they were crazy at the time too, and they won. It took 17 years, but we do not burn any more coal in this province. So, we do win campaigns, and I have no doubt we will win this campaign too. It's just a matter of, how much money will be wasted before, the global nuclear industry really is ended. Globally speaking, nuclear industry is tanking, and that's why the industry is talking now about rebuilding their existing reactors, because there's no market for new reactors. Ontario has no plans to build new reactors. They're too expensive. So the only hope now for the industry globally is to rebuild existing reactors. And we think that Ontario should take advantage of the global shutdown. Now, all of our reactors in Canada are 20 or 30, 40, 50 years old. And we should become experts in decommissioning nuclear stations instead of just running them to the ground and hope for the best.
One of the aspects of shutting down the nuclears, and we always hear about this, is the potential loss of jobs for power workers. And their unionized jobs are good jobs. What do you say to the power workers?
We say the opportunity is in decommissioning the stations. So OPG's current plan is to run the stations till the end of their life. In this case, they're saying Pickering, say 2024, although they're applying for a license till 2028, and then leave the station sit idle for 30 years. At which point, only then would they decommission, and that would be a 12-year process. So with OPG's plan, Pickering won't be usable in any form or completely decommissioned until 2070. And we say those workers that know the station, they should be the ones that are hired to decommission that station. So shut the station down in 2018 when its current license expires, and do the decommissioning immediately, at which point by 2030 we'll have some use of that site, and those workers will be kept employed. So it's essentially a jobs transition program.
It sounds eminently reasonable. Glenn Murray, our environment minister now in Ontario, claims that we're the cleanest, greenest province, or we will be, or we're on the track to be. So when you speak to him or his office, what is the reaction to this?
Well, we've been meeting for the last, year with members of all the parties, right. All 4 parties. And I would say everybody agrees with us when we visit with them. We walk out of those meeting rooms thinking, yeah, we totally convinced them. They get it, but nothing ever comes of it. And likewise, even with the NDP, we haven't heard Andrea Horwath talk about shutting down the Pickering station. I can only explain that it's not politically popular yet. We haven't built the mass uprising, the public awareness, and it just is more politically, it's easier just to go with the flow than to change directions. That's my only explanation.
There's something else we haven't touched on either, the insurance ramifications. Now, I do remember reading somewhere, especially after Fukushima and others, that insurance companies are are very, very skittish about insuring installations and refurbishments. That's another tract, of course.
Right. So the Canadian insurance industry does not, for the last couple of decades, have only insured nuclear stations or facilities $75 million. So in the case of a massive accident, which looking at Fukushima, we're looking at maybe close to $500 billion that cleanup is going to cost, and it will go on forever. So $75 million is peanuts. But in the last year, the federal government has revisited that, and they have changed the Canadian Nuclear Liability Act so that companies have to get $1 billion of liability. So they have to pay for that, but we're still talking the rest of the tens of billions of dollars in the case of an accident will be covered by you and I, taxpayers.
Yeah, and presumably even the costs of those policies will be covered by us as well if we're fully supporting them. So to get back to the Scarborough by-election, because it was kind of a test market for you and for many that happened here in Ontario. And for those of you who perhaps were away during the summer and didn't hear what happened, the Conservatives won what was a Liberal stronghold. We came in, the NTP came in third, Liberals came in second, which was really roundly seen as kind of a commentary on the Wynne government here. But meanwhile, you were busy bees. You were out there. You were talking to people about this issue. What did they tell you? What on this issue?
Well, on this issue, we got the sense that people knew that there was a Pickering nuclear station very near their homes, but they weren't aware that OPG wanted to extend its license. They didn't realize how old the station was. They just didn't have much information about it. When we talked to them about it, once they read our leaflet, they signed our petition, close-pickering.ca, and they came on board. They came to our public meetings, and they came through with us when we did the poll. What was also interesting during that by-election was we queried all of the candidates, and the NDP candidate and the Green Party candidate came forward and said, if we were elected, we would shut that Pickering station in 2018 when its current license expires. So we took that as a sign that the NDP was open to shuttering the station. It would be nice, and we're still pushing for Andrea to make it a priority for your party, and we'll hear more from the energy critic. And from her as well, but we did get the signal.
It is the NDP party policy in Ontario, just so you know, because we looked it up. It says basically no extension of nuclear, so that implies a phase out. It's part of our policy handbook. So,
Great.
So just so you know, it's still on the books as our policy. Hasn't been changed. So in other words, the reaction was positive. Sometimes, and I'll just share a little bit of, from other struggles, environmental struggles, where, especially if it's next door to you, like Pickering is to many people in Scarborough Rouge River, or say diesel trains in my riding running through. I mean, there is resistance, but there's also concern because people are concerned about their property values, quite frankly. And for many in Scarborough Rouge River, who are first-generation Canadians, folk who are working 3-4 jobs, it's a very working-class riding, at least the parts of it that I was out there canvassing. And their home is all they've got. The home represents a huge achievement, all their equity, and they're concerned that the prices of their houses will go down. Did you hear that at all?
We are aware of that concern, and it's very valid because their price values are down. And surely, if there was an accident, they'd be hooped. Mm-hmm. No home insurance covers a nuclear accident. And OPG's current evacuation plan is to shelter in place, which is pretty crazy, but partly because they know that there's no opportunity to evacuate that many people. But if that many people had to leave, like in the case of Fukushima, people's homes are not insured. And we also know once the station is closed, their property values will rise again. And the people of Pickering are nobody's aware that, or from our understanding, people are not aware that OPG is applying for a license extension. Those people first bought into the Pickering community thinking that OPG was going to close the station in 2007. Then they got a 6-year license till 2013. Then they got a 5-year license till 2018. Now they're saying in the media that they want to keep it open till 2024, but they're applying for a license till 2028. The citizens of Pickering are very unhappy about this.
And yet both these ridings voted Conservative. Have you talked to Patrick Brown? Have you had any audience with the new Conservative leader here?
We've seen Patrick Brown at events, and he's expressed interest in water power. We think that actually his party is the most likely to call for the shutdown of the Pickering station. The new member who was elected, Raymond Cho, when he was on city council, he voted for the closure of Pickering.
Did he?
Yes.
Oh, that's good to know.
Just a few months ago. But at a public forum, I called him on that and said, why did you call for the closure of Pickering at a city council meeting, but just a couple of months later on our all candidates questionnaire, you're now saying keep it open. And he said he didn't know, but he'd look into it. So there's hope there. And, the Conservatives are all about lower electricity rates. So
fiscal responsibility, presumably. So this is not very fiscally responsible. So moving from nuclear for a bit, because Ontario Clean Air Alliance is not only about nukes. What's some of the other work you're doing?
Well, our raison d'etre for forming was to call for the coal phase out, and then once we won that, we turned our attention to calling for the nuclear phase out. But we don't consider ourselves green energy experts, though we know that once we start phasing out nuclear power, that leaves room for the green energy community to rise. So we're working with them, and many green energy companies are members with us, but our focus is nuclear power, and our proposal is to replace the Pickering and Darlington stations, in that order, with conservation and water power imports from Quebec. So we've spent a lot of time reviewing the Hydro-Quebec's reserves and opportunities there, and also the conservation.
But meanwhile, you're also a cycling advocate, because I see you're on your bike and you were behind the Bloor Street cycle lanes, et cetera, et cetera. So that's still a love of yours.
That's
obviously.
a love of mine as a volunteer effort. As different as opposed to the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. But yes, I would say, bicycles are akin to renewable energy. People-powered transport is the future. That's how we make
burning
our
fat,
cities.
not fuel, as I say.
Burn fat, not fuel. Love it.
Now, when you look at from the time when Tucker was with us, and most folk know, certainly in the cycling community, who Tucker Gomberg was. There's been quite an explosion of cycling in the city. It's amazing. And infrastructure, too, I have to say. But we're still a long way from being a safe city to cycle in. We still experience a lot of cycling deaths. Do you want to comment on that? Like, where do you think we're at, and what do you think we need to do?
Well, it's really interesting. Back in the 90s, before I moved to Toronto, Toronto was considered the most bicycle-friendly city in Canada. And then for some reason, around the turn of the century, they just stopped, and a couple of the local cycling groups folded, and the city had been supporting them, and they folded. And meanwhile, Vancouver and Montreal, Edmonton, Ottawa started just really building their bicycle infrastructure such that they are great North American cycling cities, namely Vancouver and Montreal. But Toronto just stopped in its tracks and has done very little, though the population, still is crying out for it and getting out there. And now we've built some nice new thoroughfares for bicycles in the downtown Richmond and Adelaide, and now bike lanes on Bloor, which, by the way, I just circulated an article that campaign for bike lanes on Bloor started in 1897.
1897?
Yeah,
really?
Cyclists have been calling for that route there. So,
and back then it was a dirt trail, I'm sure.
I'm sure. So in 2005, after the passing of Tucker Gomberg, my partner, some cyclists came together and wanted a legacy project in his honor, wanted to advocate for one. And we called for bike lanes on Bloor. Up until that point, it was never a real campaign. It was just included on the list of bicycle wishes. And so we created this campaign, and we started doing events and big bike rides, and then it morphed into a couple of different groups, including Bells on Bloor, then this Cycle Toronto got involved. And on August 12th of this year, I'll never forget. It was 11 years after we started advocating for bike lanes on Bloor. August 12th was Tooker's birthday. The city officially inaugurated the initial tranche of the bike lane, which is just a 2-kilometer stretch, and it's a 1-year pilot project. But the original vision of Take the Tooker, is what we called the campaign, is to extend all the way along Bloor and Danforth from Mississauga to Scarborough and just be a massive bicycle expressway for cyclists. It's perfect because there's no streetcar tracks, and it extends the whole spine of the city. So that's what we're pushing for now. We're still distributing our Bike Lanes on Bloor bike stickers, and we're still next Sunday we're organizing another bike ride leaving Christie Pitts at 11 o'clock in the morning. We're not stopping. We want the full length of the extension.
Talking to you, Angela, is a joy because you're so high energy and you're always around. And you're one of those folk, I have to say, at Queen's Park, because people wonder about lobbyists. Well, you're a lobbyist, but You're the best kind of lobbyist because it's really about just knocking on every door and making sure everybody knows where you stand on everything. It just takes a lot of work. So thank you for that. And what would you say to folk, because and including me, because I have to admit there are days, especially on the environment, especially with climate change, and throw in the nuclear file, put the whole thing together. It seems pretty hopeless. It's really easy to be a depressed environmentalist. So what would you say to those folk? What's a way? I mean, you have been successful on your ventures. So looking forward, what would you advise?
Okay, so I've been working on these environmental issues for 30 years as an activist, and most of the campaigns have failed, and most of them are, seem unwinnable, but over the 30 years, I've seen so much change. So when I think of Tooker, he passed away in 2004, how many of the seeds that he planted are now like common sense, both in Edmonton and in Toronto, and the shift is happening. I choose to focus on the shift. We win the odd one. It's fun. I'd rather be working on this than doing something that doesn't have as much meaning. So even though we're losing, we're winning the big picture. Well, I think so. And, I'm an optimistic person, and it's a lot more fun to be optimistic. And I often say to myself and to my friends, I'm not attached to the results of my work.
Even though, quite frankly, you've had some pretty stupendous results when you look at it.
Exactly. It's just, also I should say, it's very important to me to take super good care of my health. So mind-body connection, that means yoga, cycling, lots of activity every day. There's no laziness in my life, but that shows, my body and mind are healthy, and I'll just keep giving it as long as I can.
So great to talk to a feminist activist. So, ladies and gentlemen, in case you just tuned in, it's Angela Bischoff. You're listening to Three Women. I'm Sherry DeNovo. I'm your host on this show. And we're just back after a summer hiatus, and we're going to keep going. Nothing's going to stop us now after that little burst of energy. We're going to take a bit of a break here, pay some bills, and we're going to come back with none other than Member of Parliament Niki Ashton to talk about her first day back after her summer hiatus. Here's a tune.
Granddaddy fought the war back in 43, shot up on the beaches in Normandy. He fought for me, he fought for peace. He was just a boy forced to be a man, but even a man couldn't understand the things he'd seen. But he fought for peace. He's seen hurt and he's seen pain. He drank right to keep the ghost away, and he fought for peace. Now I'm living in Dorothy. In the earth there's an evergreen tree. I got a job and I've got a good husband, and I remember freedom ain't free. Granddaddy lay awake in the middle of the night, thinking he was still in the firefight back in Normandy. left in the mud and the men they've been, where he fought for peace. He's seen hurt and he's seen pain. He drank right to keep the ghosts away, and he fought for peace. Now I'm living in Dolphin. In the yard there's an evergreen tree. I got a job and I've got a good husband, and I remember freedom ain't free. I'll always remember. I'll always remember. I'll always remember him. I'll always remember. I'll always remember. I'll always remember him. Oh, now I'm living in Dolphin. In the yard there's an evergreen tree. I got a job and I've got a good husband. I remember freedom ain't free. I remember freedom ain't free. I remember freedom ain't.
Right here, right now, every day. CIUT 89.5, Toronto. Sound of your city.
And welcome back. You're listening to Three Women here on CIUT 89.5 FM, Toronto's last alternative radio station. We're very proud of that, by the way, that we are alternative. Your host here, Sherry DeNovo, MPP Parkdale High Park, and now delighted to have on air from Manitoba, well, actually from Ottawa, by way of Manitoba, Niki Ashton, Member of Parliament. Niki, welcome to Three Women.
Oh, thank you so much, Sherry. I'm so thrilled to join you and Angela and be on this, as I called it on Twitter, rad feminist show.
It's the only one of its kind that I'm aware of, so we got to keep that F word going. So tell us, you just had your first day back, not at work, of course, you've been working, I know what the job's like, but first day back in the House sitting. What was question period like today?
Well, I mean, first off, it was notable that unfortunately our Prime Minister wasn't here today, and I understand he won't be here all week. So that always, doesn't really give us all the chances, certainly as opposition parties, to ask the tough questions of the Prime Minister directly. So as we did spend our time asking ministers the tough questions, and I really am proud by the priorities that we put forward in the NDP today. We talked about how the Liberal government is continuing the healthcare cuts brought under Harper, which of course will have a devastating impact on our healthcare systems and certainly on our province's abilities to deliver healthcare the way it should be.
How did they justify that? What did they say?
Well, it was interesting because the health minister did say that they're doing things differently, and she considers healthcare very a real priority, but they certainly didn't agree with the notion that they were doing as Harper did, which it seems to be a theme that we're seeing more and more of. We also asked about the climate change or the carbon emission targets that we know the Liberals are not changing either since Harper's time, and that elicited another strange response, this time from the Minister of Environment, who much like she did in the interview over the weekend, said yes, the targets remain the same, but they're really sincere about them. So it's strange, certainly, to hear this time and time again, especially from a government that ran on the notion of delivering real change, and that's not what we're seeing. We also asked some tough questions on the failure to live up to obligations to First Nations youth. We asked about the fact that the Canadian government did not sign the agreement on nuclear non-proliferation, which the minister tried to shuffle off as well, saying that they're doing other things to put a stop to nuclear non-proliferation, which it's hard to imagine that that there are other important things besides supporting supporting this agreement. And and then and just generally, it was interesting to see sort of the government be on the defensive on jobs, on the economy as well, which we know is not is in a difficult spot. A lot of Canadians are in a difficult spot. So we're back at it, and and there's much more to come.
Cindy Blackstock sent out quite an angry tweet about the lack of funding for equality for First Nations children. That kind of reiterated a number of things the government is spending money on. And strangely, when you mentioned First Nations, I mean, that was one of the very core promises. I've had Ms. Bennett on this show before she was a cabinet minister a couple of times, and that really was her raison d'etre, So what's happening there?
Mm-hmm. For sure, and I'm so glad that you referred to Cindy Blackstock's work. I mean, she's been incredible in truly holding the government to account, and warns all of us that we could be repeating that same cycle of abuse and neglect, similar to the residential schools, and we don't want to be apologizing down the line. We don't want a lost generation of First Nations youth. So let's do what we need to do now and live up to our obligations and address the chronic underfunding and the systemic racism that is rampant throughout the system. We asked those tough questions today as well. My colleagues Romeo Saganash and Charlie Angus were up in the House asking about this, and with a particular focus on health. In fact, I understand that 99% of health requests, specialized health requests for First Nations youth, are rejected by the federal government. And we're talking about things like, braces to, other things that other kids might have access to through, through the system and obviously through insurance that First Nations youth can't imagine accessing. And so pretty fundamental stuff. And both the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, Minister Bennett, and the Minister of Health, talked about how they're doing their best and that these are very serious issues. So again, this real focus on rhetoric. This is a government that talks repeatedly about reconciliation and a commitment to reconciliation, but they're not following it up with action. And if anything, the continued underfunding is continuing, and not just underfunding, but as we heard today as well, outright rejection of in terms of the asks that First Nations youth are making, based on their health needs.
Now, Niki, you're currently the critic for Jobs, Employment and Workforce Development, and as such, you've been doing this cross-country tour on precarious employment. And I was lucky enough to be to sit in on one of the evenings here, and the stories that certainly we heard that evening were shocking, but not surprising, I guess is how I'd characterize them. I mean, young folk, some of them not so young, in their 30s, who, are just going from part-time job, contract job, working in restaurants, even with advanced degrees, never seeing their way to ever doing anything like owning property or being able to afford a family. It was pretty depressing. Is that what you've been hearing across the country?
Absolutely, and thank you for being there, Sherry. It was really energizing to have you join in and share the perspective of the community that you represent, and certainly the young people that you get a chance to work with. I mean, our meetings both in Scarborough and Toronto were incredibly powerful. We heard stories of basically youth increasingly on the margins. I mean, one word that, in fact, a young lawyer who's been through the cycle of unpaid internships and exploitative work used the word despair to describe the situation that she and her generation are facing, that the millennial generation is facing. We know that youth employment or youth unemployment is particularly acute in issues in regions like Toronto, in many of our big cities across the country. And so when we're talking about precarious work. This is increasingly a collective phenomenon, and it extends beyond work. We're talking about what's increasingly being referred to as a precarious generation. Young people that are saddled with the highest levels of student debt, incapable of affording rent, let alone being able to dream of owning a home and putting down roots. And all the while balancing, precarious jobs without security, without benefits. And what's interesting is so we set this forward a few months ago, and we said, look, this is an emerging crisis. We need to deal with it, and I know it to be the case for my own generation, for my peers, for my own family, my friends, but hitting the road and hearing from folks in Halifax and in the far north. We're actually going out to Vancouver this week, and we'll be in Calgary and Edmonton. It's clear that this is touching everybody. And it's structural, right? I mean, this is a reflection of this is the impacts of neoliberalism. This is the impacts of governments that have wielded heavy privatization agendas, cutting the public sector, deregulation, and it's young people who are paying the price. And the troubling thing here is, besides the difficulty young people are facing today, is that they don't see hope. Nobody's saying that when they're 50 it's going to get better. And so we need to take this seriously, and certainly what we've been saying and reflecting what we've been hearing is that this is a national emerging crisis, and it requires national leadership, and that's what we're keen to call on. And I'll also put a plug for our forum at the end of October here on Parliament Hill. We're hosting a forum called The Precarious Generation: Millennials Fight Back, and it's there where we're keen to piece together an agenda, a comprehensive agenda of what it means to tackle the rise of precarious work and precarity amongst young people.
I want to turn my attention to Niki, because I know we don't have you for a long time, just a good time. And you were one of the few. Certainly, the NDP was wiped out in Toronto in the last election. You were one of the few that was not, and you've been elected multiple times. In fact, you're going to be celebrating in office 10 years coming up in a couple of years as well. So what do you credit that with? Why did so many not survive this last kind of red sweep of the Liberal Party? And sweeps do happen. But why did you survive? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Well, we certainly beat back the sweep where we were as well. We certainly didn't win by the margin we'd hoped we would, and we could feel it. It was palpable. In fact, I lost colleagues or a colleague in Manitoba, and we lost significant ground as well. But no question, the loss of so many incredible colleagues in Toronto and in other parts of the country like the Atlantic was a huge blow. And in the months following the election, we've certainly heard a lot of feedback and the ways that we as a party could have done better, been bolder, been certainly more clear in terms of a progressive agenda, an agenda that challenges the status quo. I've certainly been on the record and expressed concern about our stand on the balanced budgets, which I disagreed with, and I do feel confident that we've learned from that, and of course now we're entering an exciting period. A leadership race is upon us, without of course any candidates yet, but I think it gives a real opportunity for the process certainly ought to give us a real opportunity to reconnect to our roots. To reestablish what we stand for, reconnect with those progressive roots. And
I was thrilled to hear Tom Mulcahy call us one of our core values, socialism, of course. So
yes,
and feminism,
and
by the way.
Feminism, yes. exactly, and hey, and I know you and I have talked about this. Bernie Sanders brought it back in a big way, and it never left. And I'm very, very. This is socialism is an integral part of who we are as a party. It's something that certainly a perspective that increasingly many young people are looking to, noting that the current system is failing them. And I feel that there have been certainly in the last few months a lot of energizing conversations, including from people like yourself and folks that are elected, folks that are activists on the ground that are saying, we need to regroup, we need to stand for something, and what better time than with a federal government that talks left or talked left and is acting right, than to bring forward a true left and progressive agenda.
Now, I noticed you segued very quickly when I asked you, why did you survive? So the feminist in me, maybe it's the mother in me, is going to say, yes, but it's you, Niki Ashton, that survived. So what do you think you did differently in your riding? Because, so many times when these sweeps happen and the advice is, well, you sort of duct tape yourself to the wharf of your riding and the waves come and go and you're still there. They must like you. They must like you.
I love the imagery. We have a lot of lakes, so that would definitely work where we are. I mean, no question. We worked hard in terms of constituency work. We worked hard to be visible, and I did a lot of work and on a personal level with emerging social movements in our region. With incredible activists from Idle No More, activists on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Because you were critic for Aboriginal affairs at one point as well.
Yeah, and status of women as well. So, but I made sure, and this is sort of a perspective I think lots of us as New Democrats share, is all politics is local. And I'm proud to be rooted in my constituency. Of course, I'm from the north. I'm from where I represent. But these national and global issues that we're also passionate about as progressives always have a local dimension, and that has always been critical for me to act on it, to represent the issues that Indigenous communities, that working people, people struggling in poverty have in our constituency. And the other thing I would note is I have the honor of representing one of the youngest constituencies in Canada, and for us it was very important, not just to talk about millennials doing politics, but doing politics as millennials and engaging with young people, in terms of where they're at, in terms of where we're at, and I don't think that's applicable only to our constituency. I think that's certainly where we as a progressive movement need to be going nationally as well. I mean, with the immense challenges, whether it's climate change or again the emerging crisis of precarious work, we need to be working in solidarity with young people across this country, and I would argue that we have no choice otherwise. It is about the future.
You've managed to bridge, because we often hear this, this divide between kind of big city and small town, big city, south versus north. You seem to be able to bridge that. Any tricks? Any tips?
Well, I think it's a fundamental notion of justice, and justice doesn't just pertain to one issue or one place. I mean, if you believe in fundamentally achieving justice, then that is it's applicable globally as well, and anywhere. And I'm proud over the years to have fought on issues that matter to people and in a very local sense, but also to have taken on national issues as well, and I think that's those bridges always have to be built. And there's always needs to be. We always need to keep in mind, that sense of solidarity, and how do we go beyond sort of our corner of existence and build that solidarity beyond. And frankly, I think again as progressive movements. That is another area where we need to get reacquainted is that idea of building solidarity with social movements, with people that are increasingly changing conversations and pursuing change, period, in our own country and around the world, and we need to be taking a page from their book and working alongside them to affect change as well.
We had a really startling example of that in downtown Toronto just during TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival, which gains, of course, people from all over the world, and it was interrupted by a demonstration of First Nations in solidarity with the folk in Standing Rock and the Dakotas, and they tied up all of King and Bay Street, like right in the heart of Toronto. So, and people let them. I mean, there was this general feeling of solidarity with them from all of those people dressed up going to TIFF. So it's sort of big city meets First Nations, right in the belly of the Toronto Beast, and it was quite the moment.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
There's something. I mean, obviously, obviously social movements are alive and well in Toronto. I was there for Pride and saw the way in which Black Lives Matter, created space and forced all of us to say this matters. And so I'm glad to hear once again it took place through with Indigenous folks at the helm. These are the conversation. These are the people changing conversations. Activism like BLMTO, activism like what we're seeing from Indigenous activists. And actually, yesterday in my hometown in Manitoba, a number of Indigenous activists got together. And while I had to be on a flight to Ottawa, a good friend of mine shared a message of solidarity with those standing with the Dakota Sioux, with those standing at home, but also all of us standing with the Dakota Sioux in North Dakota.
Amazing. So, well, thank you very much. I know you have to go. I know you're hard at work. Great talking to you, and give our regards from Toronto to all of those in Ottawa. And we look forward to that, hearing about the Precarious Forum when that comes up. Take care, Ms. Niki Ashton.
Thank you so much, Sherry, and it was a real thrill. And here's to the sisterhood. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
So, Angela, you've been sitting patiently listening to all of that news from the federal front. Any thoughts? I hadn't talked to you about First Nations and their role really in the battle for climate justice.
Well, at the Bruce nuclear site, the local First Nation there holds the balance of power really on that decision, because the federal government, the OPG has claimed that they won't move forward with the project if they don't get the First Nation support. So at this point, First Nations are sort of holding out. They're not saying yay or nay. I'm a little bit nervous about that, but we're hoping that they'll come through for us. But it's been really fascinating, the whole North Dakota Sioux tribe fight against the access pipeline. That's just been a fascinating development. There are thousands of First Nations people from all around North America.
I have to say, too, it's been fascinating in terms of media impact, too. I had the honor of meeting with Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! You were at the same forum here during TIFF, and her talking about the fact that it was their footage at Democracy Now!, this alternative station. It was their footage that got picked up by the majors because nobody was covering it, of course. Everybody was hanging on DT's every word, and they weren't actually covering what was happening on the ground in terms of climate justice. So it was exciting to hear that just from a journalist perspective. And I gather while she was sitting there talking to us, she was being charged, criminally with trespass. So interesting.
That's the power of the alternative media. Here's to CIUT, because she really brought that issue to the fore. There were thousands of First Nations people there, but no national coverage of that fight.
I mean, they literally set the dogs on them, poor dogs, but set the dogs on them, and the violence was unbelievable. And I think that footage really kind of galvanized some national interest and concern about what was going on there. But it shows, again, this coming together of First Nations and climate justice, which is so critical. There was a lot of action on social media saying, in our own Canadian context, saying, Prime Minister Trudeau, if you think you're going to do Energy East, or if you think you're going to revisit Keystone XL, just look what's happening in North Dakota and think twice, because this was an incredible coming together, I guess, similar in the sense in Keystone XL in the States, with First Nations and climate activists.
And now we're looking at the Energy East. That looks like that's on hold. And then what's the one heading west called? That one, they're still holding out for First Nations support on that, and they're not getting that. Mm-hmm. So it really is a confluence of several different issues, environment, First Nations coming together on these social justice issues.
And of course it's not, and we have to remember, First Nations voice is not a uniform one. There are various responses. So as you're finding out in the Bruce, when do you think you'll hear, in terms of the Bruce reality, what's going to happen there?
It's quite imminent. At this point, we're waiting for federal approval. Actually, it's in the hands of Catherine McKenna, the Environment Minister. So we're hopeful that the federal government will say no to OPG's request. They've gotten they've done like an EI process, and they've had a judicial review, and they've gotten support on that front. But right now, it's being held up by
So they've got the
Catherine
environmental
McKenna.
review?
They had an environmental assessment, and they got approval essentially. But now Catherine McKenna has put things on hold and asked OPG for some more information. But like, for example, they never even considered one other site. They spent years only considering this one deep geological
How did they get
repository.
an environmental okay? That makes me want to question the environmental review process, obviously. So.
Well, and we're asking for a review of the EA process federally.
Yeah, and so Minister McKenna has not yet ruled on this, so there is some
Correct.
hope there.
There is hope.
What's your scuttle on that? What's your intel there?
Well, potentially she'll just keep delaying it, and then OPG will have to consider other proposals, in depth, and that will delay the whole process. And ultimately, it isn't because it's OPG's proposal. Ultimately, it's a provincial government decision. So even if Catherine McKenna does give it the green light, it still becomes a provincial issue, and you can be sure it's going to become a provincial election issue.
Again, it's somewhat concerning sometimes when local, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the last I'd heard about that site, and again, this is bearing nuclear waste, that the local government was quite excited about it, I guess because of the money that is involved. Again, that's concerning.
It is. Well, has been a federal review going on, and at this point, there's about 9 municipalities in Northern Ontario that are vying for all of Canada's high-level nuclear waste buried in their communities. I mean, they're part of a process where they're going to make a lot of money, even just for being part of the process. They're making millions of dollars. These small communities,
Of course,
but,
they're
they see
suffering
it as
and there are no jobs. I
Yeah,
know.
these are poverty-stricken, First Nations and other small towns in Northern Ontario with no prospects for a future to keep their younger people living there. So they're exploring it.
Which is, I think, going to be the critical. We only have a few minutes left, but just to touch on this, because I think we should. It's that critical conversation that we touched on earlier with the Power Workers Union and jobs and the environment. It shouldn't be either or. But so often it's pitted that way, that in this instance it's, we'll be creating jobs. As one friend said, if we don't have a climate, there will be no jobs. But I mean, apart from that bleak scenario, I'm getting there. We have to be able to have these conversations across that divide. What's your sense of that?
Well, I see green energy as being a great potential job creator, and we create many more jobs per dollar invested in green energy and conservation than we do in these huge mega projects, which are very capital intensive, whether it's nuclear or large dams or large fossil fuel projects. So renewable energy, all of those local communities in the north and First Nations, they should be creating their own electricity on site, wind, solar, geothermal. The opportunities are huge for us all to be creating
And this is already
decentralized
operational.
power.
This is already operational in many places in Europe. I mean, this
Yes.
is happening already.
It's
So we don't have to invent anything. We can just recreate what they're doing in Germany, for example.
The
and other
green
places.
energy revolution is happening globally. All the private investment is going into decentralized, smaller scale green energy. And that's the way the whole world is moving. Ontario is behind the 8 ball in investing in these huge multi-billion